Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I'm really delighted to be here to speak with you today about something that is so important to all of us. Americans, as we know, love to talk about education. It is commonly said that the public school in particular is the cradle of democracy, our first shared civic experience, the way we learn to interact in a diverse society, the way we learn to interpret our history and apply our culture. Of course, this is true of most societies. Schooling is so obviously important that every society feels pressure to get it right. But while most Western countries spend their energies fighting about curricula, belief systems, and money matters in education, in the United States, we get to fight not only about all of these, but also about another concern that has been at the heart of American education since even before the nation was formed. I'm referring to the question of who has the right to control education in our country. In most European nations, by the mid-20th century at the latest, schooling had become severely centralized. There, the state has the great majority of control and influence in education policy. Class levels, tracks, and systems are not locally or parentally established, but are widely understood to be the business of government experts, often at the national level. In the United States, however, education has always been a dance between two partners, the family and the public community, often represented by government, and especially beginning in the 20th century, by professionally trained educational experts. In the United States, we have strong historical commitments to both public influence, these days often federal, and family or other local control. The question of who should control education, local communities, even parents and families, or state and federal governments and professional experts, has never been resolved in the United States. So I want to discuss today some of the history of this tension between ideas of federalization on the one hand and subsidiarity on the other in our children's schooling. This is an especially important matter to consider today because many of us in 2017, not least the media, but certainly also Americans in general, see so much general movement towards bigger, more externally controlled schools that we are unaware of the historical and cultural strength of concepts of local control and subsidiarity in our country. I further believe that many of us approve of federal efforts to right entrenched wrongs such as racial and socioeconomic segregation in education, wrongs which nonetheless continue to plague our systems. But many of us also see the decline of the neighborhood school beginning in the 1950s as also the beginning of an unmistakable decline in American education overall. And we are all too aware of the obstacles that local initiatives in education often face. The overwhelming adoption of the Common Core curriculum by both private and public schools across the country has also given the impression that the direction in education is now inexorably moving toward federal control. Whether one approves or disapproves of this direction as educational policy, national news reports, as well as local experiences with public schools implementing state and national level curricula and testing programs, in fact overstate the strength of the federalizing, consolidating, standardizing trend in education. In fact, throughout American history, the impulse towards localized, specialized, adaptive education has been just as strong as that towards federalization. Without this concept, American education would look dramatically different today. Americans in general have in fact always agreed that both the public and parents have rights and responsibilities in education, and not just the responsibility to send children to school, but the right to influence how and what children are taught. We just don't always, I think, notice it. So in this talk, I would like us to take a look together at one example of how this double view of education in America, the view that it is both a public and a private good, and that both families, the ultra-local community, and governments have rights and responsibilities toward the education of children, has presented itself historically and in the present day through the example of American homeschooling. Now, when we think of homeschooling in this context, what comes to mind? We're maybe a little bit of a strange audience to ask that question to here, since so many of us have personal experience with homeschooling, and we aren't an ordinary sample. But let us at least say that historically, since American homeschooling first came to wide public notice in the 1970s, Americans have tended to think of it as ultra-private and therefore unsuited to the public good. After all, unlike every other sort of schooling, it takes place at home. What could be more local, and what could be more isolationist? In spite of the long history of home tutoring in this country before 1900, by the time the first modern homeschoolers emerged in the mid-20th century, any newspaper mention of a homeschooling court case, or even just an interesting family who homeschooled, usually brought forth a number of letters to the editor decrying home education, although a few also usually suggested a policy of live and let live. As late as the 1980s, 75% of Americans thought that homeschooling was, quote, a bad thing for the nation, end quote, with only 16% believing it was a good one. In fact, homeschooling at this time was so private and so reclusive that most educators were sure the movement, which comprised in the 1980s only about 10 to 15,000 American children, would fizzle out by the end of the decade. Why? Because, in fact, it wasn't a movement at all. Homeschooling was defined by its isolationism and lack of community, its total rejection of the public. This was in part because most homeschoolers thought their local schools were dangerous to their children for one reason or another. However, it was also because they were so frightened of legal action, of nosy neighbors seeing a child at home during school hours and turning tattletale, or of harassment by truant officers. They were so frightened of these that the great majority of them totally isolated themselves from any educational community, and sometimes even from social communities altogether. As one homeschooler remembered about that time, there was no other option but to fly completely under the radar, and that meant having no help at all. In other words, early American homeschooling responded to this question of who should control education, the family or the public, by falling squarely, completely, and totally on the side of the family. It is true that to homeschool in the early years was by necessity to be an isolationist, to reject schools altogether and withdraw from the community and usually from public sight. Although homeschooling is now legal in all 50 states, for many decades, and in many states, the matter was not really legally clear. Could a homeschool, for example, count as a private school and therefore function legally? Or would even attempting to register your homeschool, whether or not homeschooling was in fact legal in your state, lead to a painful investigation and possibly even temporary loss of custody of your children? Yet although these problems were real, the isolation inherent in homeschooling in the 1970s and 80s was in fact destroying homeschooling as an educational possibility. Flying under the radar meant that homeschoolers were not even aware of other local families that were homeschooling. They had almost no support whatsoever. With very few correspondence schools or homeschooling curricula available, most homeschooling families started completely from scratch. All of them, whether religious or secular, politically liberal or conservative, scouring the same 2 or 3 homeschooling books by alternative educators John Holt and Raymond and Dorothy Moore. Nothing else was available to them. This isolationist model was unsustainable. How then did homeschooling survive, and how did it come to thrive to the point where there are now roughly 2 million American homeschoolers, where, in other words, every American normative school classroom is missing one student because of homeschooling? Even more importantly, how do we get to the point where public school districts themselves are acknowledging that homeschooling is an effective educational option and one that is, in fact, a matter of parental rights? And let me pause here to say that even if you may think anecdotally that this is not the case, I will offer in a moment a powerful example of just how much homeschooling has been culturally accepted as a right, even if it is not commonly embraced by the public as the best choice. I argue that the answer to these questions lies in community, and yes, even judiciary and political commitment to principles of local control in education, a commitment which has persisted in spite of powerful counter-trends towards higher level control of schooling. It happened because, and in the context of, the development of what I would like to call the public home school. In order to revive and retain homeschooling as a viable option, homeschooling families beginning in the 1980s, when the movement was supposed to die out, progressively found more and more effective ways to invite wider communities, even public schools and governments, back into their children's schooling without sacrificing the primary principle of parental, in other words, ultra-local control. And most significantly, drawing on their own values, embracing subsidiarity as a reasonable approach in American education, these wider communities, the public, responded at the local level with openness to conversations and a willingness to cooperate with homeschooling parents. In these ways, public homeschooling, schooling that emerges from home supervision but involves public communities and resources, brings together private and public goods, rights, and responsibilities in education in a uniquely American way based on the importance of local control. And this is going on at the same time as schools overall continue to accept more and more federal state control. The two trends coexist. I don't have time today to go over this history in full, but I want to briefly discuss 3 examples of how homeschoolers have invited the public back into their form of education in the past 40 years, and how the public has responded in order to illustrate this idea of the public homeschool that brings these two trends together. First, as I had mentioned, in the 1980s, and in fact continuing today, although to a lesser extent, homeschoolers' fear of potential harassment or even prosecution was a real one. It's extremely difficult, for example, to get accurate numbers on homeschoolers before about 2010, because sociologists would class them as a hidden population, a population that did not want to be counted because of the risks. Although in the majority of relevant court cases, families have not been required in the end to enroll their children in normative schools, much less lost custody of their children, all families know that even a visit from a Child Protective Services officer, much less a full investigation, could be traumatic. Homeschoolers' concerns in this area were legitimate, if perhaps sometimes overblown. Yet at the same time, homeschoolers in the 1980s and early 90s began to realize that homeschooling alone was often just too hard to sustain, much less grow as a movement. Their first response was to reach out for support to other homeschoolers. The problem was they didn't know any. The first significant moves towards homeschooler organizations were thus made through the help of the few homeschooling books and newsletters available, in particular John Holt's newsletter, Growing Without Schooling. Growing Without Schooling's subscription list was small and comprised of those sympathetic to homeschooling and alternative education in general. And knowing this, homeschoolers began to personally contact John Holt for support, and he was sometimes able to connect them with other homeschooling families in their states. Growing Without Schooling Issues also began to publish a voluntary directory. With minimal contact information at hand, some homeschooling families began to reach out to each other and form careful play groups that would meet in parks. While the children played, the mothers would discuss homeschooling and other topics important to them. These playgroups were carefully choreographed to try to avoid public notice. One mother told me of the terror her Los Angeles playgroup moms felt when a TV news camera happened to pan over to some of their children in a park during school hours. They all sat sweating watching the news that night, and it just didn't come on. But the chance to offer and receive support seemed worth it. Once connected, these families also began to take advantage of each other's resources to protect themselves legally. In most states, for example, it was clear that a parent with a teacher's license had the right to homeschool. Many families, therefore, signed their children up as being privately tutored by someone they knew who had a teacher's license. However, this tutoring did not really occur. It was just a legal safety net for family homeschooling. As such alliances had developed, homeschoolers realized that far from creating dangers, gathering together could actually activate the principle of safety in numbers. And so they also began formally organizing into official organizations at the state, local, and national level. The most significant of these is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, or HSLDA, which was founded in Southern California in 1983, which offers member families 24/7 access to an attorney and has been involved in nearly every significant homeschooling court case since the late 1980s, as well as having a strong lobbying arm and being a central resource for efforts to watch and change political attitudes and legislation relevant to homeschooling. In establishing such organizations, from playgroups to national legal aid societies, homeschoolers provided one another with both support and protection, as well as encouraging the development of curricula and other educational resources that could be shared through these organizations' conferences. And while such organizations remain private in the sense that they're not publicly funded, although most are open to the public, they represent the first step in inviting the public back into the education of homeschoolers. The willingness of homeschoolers to invite sympathetic private communities and networks back into their children's school lives, while still maintaining primary parental control. Secondly, as homeschoolers began to associate more and more with one another, one result was the sharing of skills and talents among homeschooling families in a new way. Early on, this meant relying on parent resources in specific, isolated ways for group outings and activities, such as a museum curator parent offering several homeschooling families a private tour of a museum. Very quickly, however, this morphed into parents sharing teaching in a more consistent way. At first, this was done privately. If you teach my Jimmy history, I will teach your Susie biology. But over time, this led to the creation of full-fledged, standalone homeschooling co-ops and academies, which often register themselves with their states as private schools. At these cooperatives, children could opt to take classes in one or two or even all of their subjects from other homeschooling parents in a context of continued heavy parental influence and supervision. Locally developed and often following specific religious belief systems or pedagogical threads, these schools provided an environment that parents considered morally and intellectually safe, while taking some of the immense burden of homeschooling off of individual mothers. They invited experts and local communities back into children's education without sacrificing parental primacy, recognizing once again the good that a wider community can provide in a child's education. A homeschooled child could now in fact receive his or her entire education at a desk in a classroom outside of the home. Finally, and perhaps most interesting, is the new public school involvement that evolved out of these new organizations and efforts at opening up to wider communities. By the mid-1990s, both homeschooling organizations and co-ops and academies were thriving, and new homeschoolers found themselves entering into a world of resources and support. But over the course of the late 90s and the early 2000s, however, and continuing today, homeschoolers took a further step that may seem surprising at first. They decided not just to invite the wider homeschooling public into their children's education, but to step away from their former total rejection of government schooling to invite public schools and their resources back into their children's lives. In doing so, they created the most extensive form of public homeschooling, homeschooling that draws on public school resources and even funding without giving up parental control. Some examples of how they did this are through extracurricular and even in-class participation in public school groups. For example, a parent would approach a coach, "Can my child play on your school football team?" And it was really up to the coach. Often there weren't policies, and this started to become more and more common. Got to the point where public school districts started to allow partial enrollment. So you could go and do your science classes at school, and you could do everything else at home. This is unthinkable in the isolationist community as well as in the hostile public school environment towards homeschooling of earlier years. Another example is through the use of community colleges by high school homeschoolers. how, of course, it was difficult at the beginning to get into a college without any sort of transcript, and before co-ops and academies, no transcripts would be available. And so homeschoolers started simply applying to community colleges early and taking some of their more advanced subjects there, developing a familiarity with the classroom, and also receiving the more standardized sort of transcript and credit from a community college that would then allow them to get into college and university. Interestingly, now many university systems, including the giant University of California, now have special applications for homeschoolers. They're so willing to invite these people back into their communities. Finally, the example of actual school districts responding to homeschoolers' need for support with policies allowing, as I had mentioned, part-time homeschooler attendance at brick and mortar schools, and even the establishment of public school district-run online homeschooling. So a school teacher at a public school would set up a course of study online. It was run by the school, it was funded by the school, you had to meet all of the public school requirements, but it happened at home. So this is the perfect blend for some families, and also allowed families to take advantage of public school funding, where you could go in and get the arts and crafts materials that you needed, or go in and use the science lab that you needed. As these examples suggest, homeschoolers had come to realize that they could work with public communities instead of isolating themselves from them. And at the same time, the public was coming on a local, if not a national level, to realize that in cooperating with homeschooling, they could fulfill their responsibilities to homeschooled children without quashing parental rights. In fact, to state one powerful example, the effect of the new public version of homeschooling was so strong and so effective in connecting to Americans' continued belief in local parent-influenced schooling that when, in 2008, the California Supreme Court unexpectedly declared homeschooling illegal, not only were homeschoolers surprised, but public school districts around the state filed amicus briefs in support of homeschooling in the appeal. Furthermore, both the head of the State Department of Education and the governor threw their full support behind the rights of parents against any such ruling. The public Los Angeles Unified School District, which was the district implicated in the original court case, actually stated that it would ignore the ruling as it stood and continue to support and allow homeschooling of various types in its district. A great public parade of educators and politicians of all political stripes, in fact, publicly agreed that, in the words of the governor, every California child deserves a quality education, and parents should have the right to decide what's best for their children. Parents should not be penalized for acting in the best interests of their children's education. This outrageous ruling must be overturned by the courts, and if the courts don't protect parents' rights, then we will. The court reversed its ruling a few months later, based on the astonishing reasoning that, in essence, since everyone in California, including the legislature, though it hadn't made laws about it, seemed to be behaving as if they thought homeschooling was legal, homeschooling must in fact be legal. The belief in local control in education is in fact, as the court so clearly saw, alive and well in America. Of course, even after the development of this public version of homeschooling, homeschooling, like all education, is still subject to the political and cultural winds. I do not want to give the impression that all is decided in this particular educational case, as many of you well know. But neither is the direction of schooling in America in general decided. American history in general does show a clear movement towards more expert and higher level government involvement in education. But if you look closely, you will see that the American commitment to local control in education has also remained strong rather than fading away, especially in terms of how local communities are willing to make adjustments in order to better serve individuals. We just do not see this trend highlighted in our national discussion. The concept of local autonomy still bears weight, even in a context of heavy state standardized testing and national influence over curricula and policies. The example of public homeschooling shows that teachers, families, and communities, and even larger governments and educational experts, can still work together to meet the needs and responsibilities of all interested parties. In fact, as we have seen in the case of homeschooling, the ongoing tension between local and federal control, between private and public interests, and between parents and wider communities can be a productive one in the education of a child. And I think we have reason to hope that, especially at the local level, this tension will continue to allow cooperation between parents, teachers, and administrators in all sorts of different educational settings, as long as we are willing to accept that all of us have an interest in protecting and providing for children. Thank you.